Going to be a conventional architectural talk where we talk about a coherent body of work, or where we try and tell you about our architectural manifesto. It's going to be a bit of a mixed bag. It's a talk about our own architectural journey from students through to where we are now. So it's part biographical, it's part travelogue, but we will try and show a few interesting architectural projects as well. But first of all, we're going to go back to the very beginning. Kasia's going to give you a bit of backstory.
Okay, so this is me, age 4, in Afghanistan with my childminder. And this is my dad in Kabul. My dad took on a job with the Afghan government designing a complex of buildings, which was something that Polish architects did do at the time quite often. During the Communist era, it was very difficult to get any freedom, and both in expression and life, and jobs abroad gave that, and also were an opportunity to make get some hard currency. But in my dad's case, it was mostly for the adventure. This is one of the photographs of my dad's from his travels while working abroad from Nuristan in the eastern part of Afghanistan. It's quite an inaccessible and remote area. And what you can see here is houses which are built on a steep escarpment in a quite harsh environment where there's not much flat land. And basically, each of the houses forms a terrace for the house above it, which is then the kind of habitable space for the family and also the animals that they keep. The houses are connected by carved logs, which create passages between the different houses and the passage to the whole village. And as you can see, the houses are made out of quite thin piece of wood because there isn't much wood around, infilled with rocks and kind of clay plaster, creating this very distinct stripy pattern. And then these carved logs, which are the ladders connecting the houses and the villages in between. Very interestingly, a lot of the ornaments have Greek origins because of the Alexander the Great's journeys across Asia centuries ago, and that still remains. And you can see that both in the architecture and also the features of the people that lived there. And at that time, Afghanistan was a very open and friendly and forward-looking place until the revolution in 1978. This is one of the pictures that my dad took when we were out there of the tanks in the streets of Kabul. And unfortunately, that was the end of Kabul and Afghanistan as we knew it, and we left pretty soon afterwards. And then my dad's work took us to Nigeria, where he worked in Lagos for a few years and Yola on the border with Cameroon. This is a picture of my brother and me in Palmyra, and I have quite vivid memories of visits to this ancient city and wandering through the ruins without any barriers or other tourists, and being able to just be there and touch the antiquity and imagine what it would have been like 2,000 years ago. But unfortunately, nowadays, you don't get many of these views because ISIS destroyed most of what was valuable of Palmyra.
So, Kasia's dad's life in architecture gave the family a whole load of memories and stories, and it's basically at the core of who Kasia's family are. And I suppose by accident, maybe by intention, we've continued in that tradition. A lot of our contemporaries from university now. They're doing well. They've stayed in the same place. They've become partners in firms. They're earning a decent living, getting some professional recognition. Maybe that could have been... This was an attempt to do a timeline of our life in architecture. So it starts off with Kasia growing up in these interesting places, me leading a very conventional childhood in England, until I go for a gap year in Zimbabwe, nothing to do with architecture. But then I come to Singapore as a student for a summer holiday job. I go to Sumatra, get fascinated by the traditional architecture of Southeast Asia and vernacular architecture more generally, and then that becomes the excuse for a whole series of student adventures. So we'll talk about a few of those quickly and then get into some proper architecture after that. This is 4 trips that we did as students. The first trip in Sumatra, then I made an overland trip looking at architecture, starting in Istanbul, travelling through Iran and Pakistan into India. Later on, together, Kasia and I made a journey from Yemen across the Red Sea to Djibouti, Ethiopia and Eritrea. And then finally our interest in architecture took us to the Sahara Desert and exploring the river Niger and some of the villages around there. There isn't possibly time to show you all of this, but I'll show you a few highlights. So this is Balembing, a village in the west of Sumatra where a group of people called the Minangkabau live. It's an Islamic society, but it's also a matriarchal culture, so it's quite an interesting mix. And they built these very striking houses with these soaring buffalo horn-shaped roofs. The houses are covered in a thatch, which is made from the leaves of the bamboo. This doesn't really fit into any story about vernacular architecture, but we thought we'd show this because this is the city of Asmara in Eritrea by the Red Sea, and it's an extraordinary place, and it's not very well known because Eritrea has had a bit of a troubled history and it's quite inaccessible. But before the Second World War, it was an Italian colony, and Italian architects would travel out here to build the most extraordinary futuristic and Art Deco buildings. It was a sort of new Rome. It was a place where they could go and experiment without the social constraints and the sort of conservation issues that you would have had building buildings back in Italy. This service station, with its huge cantilevers is quite impressive. And there's a story that in order to persuade the contractor to finally remove the props when it was being built, the architect actually had to stand underneath before he would be able to persuade the contractor that it wouldn't fall down. Okay, so the final trip we're going to talk about before we get into the proper architecture is a trip that we did together to West Africa, where Kasia actually managed to get her Cambridge College to fund a visit to try to see some of the vernacular mud architecture on the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. This is a fairly well-known village on the Bandiagara escarpment in Mali, built by the Dogon people. But we want to get a bit further off the beaten track than that. This is the river Niger, which it starts off here and it goes in a big bend and it flows out into the sea through Nigeria. But in the middle, it gets into the Sahara Desert, and between Bamako and Timbuktu, it spreads out into this inland delta, which is like an oasis in the desert. You have lots of settlements, small settlements along the river, and we wanted to explore some of those. So with an 8-week trip planned, plenty of time, not much of an idea of what we were going to find, we arrived in a place called Segu. And there we saw this builder and his boat builder and his family building these beautiful long canoes called pirogues out of mahogany. And we sat down and we watched him for a while. Here you can see he's charring the timber to waterproof it and banging cloth into the joints. And we asked, how much does one of these boats cost? And because we weren't bargaining, we were just having a conversation, he said it costs about $100. And we thought, well, actually, we're going to spend more than that on bus fares and different forms of transport over the next 2 weeks, trying to get to these really obscure places. So we commissioned him to build us a boat. We hung around for 10 days. He built a boat, and this is it. You can see the year was 1998. This is our beautiful pirogue. And we went to market, bought ourselves some kit, and we basically paddled down the River Niger. And 2 weeks later, we sold it for more or less what we paid for it. Slightly less because we actually crashed it and damaged it a bit on the way. So we would, of course, we had no map, we had no phone, no GPS. We would just paddle down the river and stop whenever we saw an interesting village or whenever it started to get dark. We would end up staying in places like this. Sometimes fishing villages where we were given a thatched hut to stay in. Sometimes the roofs of a mud building. Sometimes we were just given a bigger boat to stay in. Sometimes we just had to improvise. This is Kasia trying to rig up a sort of impromptu tent. But always people were incredibly hospitable, and we had one particularly memorable night where we turned up with a group of nomadic herders who would spend their time wandering around the delta and come back to the river during the dry season. And we stayed in their huts here. The architecture was very varied. I don't think we stayed in the same sort of building twice over the whole 2 weeks that we were on the river. But the one constant was that the mosques were always the most elaborate and permanent structures. Of course, all built out of mud, ostrich eggs on top. Even the ants were adapting their architecture to the climate here. This is an anthill, and they're building their own shading structures. Okay, so back to the timeline. So after all our student travels, our life basically falls into 3 chapters around London, Warsaw, and Singapore, with a lot of side branches. We're going to talk, first of all, Kasia's going to talk about a project in London, and I'm going to talk about a project that I did returning to Yemen during those London and Warsaw years, and then a few adventures in Russia and Ukraine, doing work for oligarchs and rather commercial sort of stuff. And then finally come to Singapore, and I'll talk in some detail about a project that I think you probably know about in Shanghai. So I'll hand back to Kasia.
I spent 8 years working for Allies and Morrison Architects in London on a few quite important projects. BBC headquarters in London and the Greenwich Observatory, but we don't have enough time to talk about all of that, so I'll just concentrate on one, and it's a London landmark, which is the Royal Festival Hall. This is a newspaper clipping from 1951. Royal Festival Hall is the building you can see here. It was designed as part of the Festival of Britain, which was meant to be a celebration of the British technology and industry and give an uplift to British people after the down years of the wartime and the rationing and lack of anything interesting. So it was a little bit like what then happened in year 2000s with a big celebration of what the British were on offer. So this is one of the original photographs from the early 1950s. The festival hall was designed and built within just 3 years by a group of talented young architects. It was supposed to be a showpiece of the modern technology and advancement of the year of the period. So it was totally customized. Everything within the building was purpose designed, including all the furniture, tapestries, carpets, light fittings, and it was the most high-tech building at the time. With its 2,500 seat auditorium, was the biggest concert hall ever constructed. So even nowadays, acoustics is a bit of a dark art. We don't really know whether things will work out or not, and back then it definitely was like that. And despite its elegant appearance and all the modern technologies used, very quickly it turned out that the acoustics of the hall were a complete failure. And from a intended classical concert hall, it just became a rock venue and somewhere where people held graduation ceremonies. And apart from that, the outdoor spaces got really cluttered by kind of additions in the 60s and 80s, cutting off the festival hall from the river. In the photos I showed you before, the river was here and was very much facing onto the South Bank and the House of Parliament on the other side. And also the whole flow of the building intended in the original design was destroyed. So in 1999, Allies and Morrison, together with auditorium specialists called Kierkegaard Associates from Chicago, were appointed to come up with a proposal to reinvigorate and bring back the festival hall to what it was supposed to be originally. So this is a image from the original concept that showed the principles that we were trying to achieve. And so what we looked at was bringing back the original flow and experience of all the public spaces, which were quite extensive in the original design. Refurbishing the auditorium to a 21st century standard for multiple users, but mostly trying to get it to become a classical concert hall again, and retain the use as it has as one of the best rock venues in town. One of the issues we had to deal with was to declutter it. It was full of all the public space were taken over by offices, so we ended up building, which I don't think you can see here, a linear building just alongside the concert hall where we decanted all the clutter. I was project architect for the refurbishment of the auditorium, so it was split into, the project was split into two, the foyers and the auditorium as two projects running parallel. The main issue we had was, like I mentioned before, the failed acoustics, and what you can see here, this is actually quite interesting. This is one of the original sketches, design sketches, showing what the intent was originally, because the building, the hall was much bigger than anything that had ever been built at the time. They're very concerned about the sound getting to the very end of the hall. So the design of the stage and the reflectors, which you can see here, was all about pushing the sound as deep into the hall as possible. And what this ended up with, and that was one of the main failures, was that the stage was dead. And when the musicians came to play, they couldn't hear each other. So you were playing, there was an orchestra of 150 people, but they're playing as individuals. They couldn't, and a lot of orchestras just refused full stop to play. Like the Berlin Philharmonic, just 40 years wasn't there. So what we had to come up with was a way of retaining what was quite successful in getting these deep spaces, hearing the music, but also bring back the music to the stage so that it was working as a proper concert hall. So it was a pleasant place, not just for the audience, but also for the musicians. The images here are the numerous studies we did of the overstage reflectors. So we studied them as models in the office. We had lots of them made. Then we had a few full-scale mock-ups constructed and tested by the acquisitions on site to check whether they were actually working for what they were intended to be. And this is a finished product, so a series of wings that were able to fold and be angled depending on what they were meant to do for the whole. So in the end, we had to strip the auditorium completely back to bare bones and rip and reassemble it to give it its intended purpose. We used that as an opportunity to relook at some of the original design features. What you can see here is the original idea of a cascading waterfall on the ceiling, and which got kind of lost through all the refurbishment that was done over the years. So we brought back the original design and the color schemes of the water and the river. And then when we introduced new elements like the overstage timber soffit with all the stage equipment above, that was meant to be following in principle what was there before, but quite distinctly modern in its new appearance. What you can see here on the right is pictures of the auditorium completely stripped back to bare concrete to get back the seating and the new configuration and all the paneling. And this is the final product of what it appears like now. There's some amazing details from the original design that we had to deal with, and all the interventions that we had to include into them had to be really carefully thought through so that they appeared as if they were either intended to be there from the very beginning, like this disabled access handrail that we cut into the original huge mahogany handrails that were forming the surround of the choir. And then this is all modern, but the language was meant to follow what was there originally. Or what you see here, which are the sides of the audience boxes, and we had to insert recessed speakers. So we came up with a way that they were there, but you couldn't see them. And this is what the festival hall, concert hall looks like now. And another image with the organ doors closed and the stage and its various configurations. And the Berlin Philharmonic that came back and decided that they're okay with playing after 40 years of complete no-no. So that's...
Okay, back to Yemen. In 2003, the British consulate in Istanbul was attacked. And of course, the 9/11 attacks in New York were still fairly fresh as well. And the UK government decided that they needed to upgrade some of their embassies around the world, and Yemen was the priority because at the time that was quite a hostile place, or a place where there was a perceived threat of terrorism. Amazingly, they decided that the best way to find an architect for this project was to hold a competition and to invite young architectural practices to enter. And of course, Kasia and I had fantastic memories of our travels in Yemen, and we were both desperate to enter this competition. Kasia had no trouble in persuading Allies and Morrison to enter. I was not even working for an architect at the time. I was designing bridges with an engineering practice, but some friends of mine had an architectural practice, and I persuaded them that we should do the competition together, and that if we won, I should come and work with them. So it was a bit of an early test of our marriage, but Kasia and I both did the competition. We both steadfastly refused not to speak to each other about what we were doing. and my team won. And Kasia's team came second. So the interview was really quite interesting. Anyway, for the next few years, this was my project. I joined Design Engine, which is a small-ish, but now not so small, practice based in London and Winchester. And we did the embassy together. This is Yemen. Wadi Hadramaut, where we were showing you the 12-story mud buildings, is down here somewhere. On our earlier trip, we crossed over the Red Sea to Djibouti and Ethiopia here. This is the port of El Hodeida, which is the main port through which everything comes into Yemen, and it's been in the news a lot recently, sadly, because it's a bit of a hotspot in the civil war. The road from El Hodeida winds its way up through the mountains to reach Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, and which is at quite a high altitude. This is a view of the city of Sana'a. In 2003, anyway, it was an absolutely beautiful and very consistent, coherent place with this architecture of fired mud brick, gypsum plaster, gardens, narrow streets, a lot of beautiful detail in the windows with alabaster and stained glass. The site for the embassy was here. So just outside the city centre, this is the old city, overlooked by a mountain behind. This was what the British government said to us on our first meeting to explain their brief, and it really neatly encapsulates the paradox that you have to confront when you're an architect designing an embassy. On the one hand, it should be an underground bunker, and on the other hand, it should be a marquee with a sign saying, "Do come in and have a cup of tea." So in other words, it's got to be very secure, but it's also got its diplomatic function to perform as an advertisement for Britain, for British culture. This was the site, and one of the requirements of the brief was that the building had to be set back 30 metres from the site boundary, so that if there was a bomb blast outside the compound, it would not reach the building at too much intensity. So that basically determined where we could situate the building on the site. But we wanted to give the building a bit of a public face, so we persuaded the client that we should open up one corner of the site visually, obviously not physically, but visually, to have a connection to the building where we could create a public face. We used landscape levels on the sloping site to zone the site and create these two public and private zones. And then we bedded the building into the landscape so that the most secure spaces were literally that underground bunker. And finally, we covered the building in a canopy and wrapped it in a screen, which served a climatic function, but also helped with the security. So this is the site plan. This is that public view, the view through the public garden, and this is the way that members of the public would come through the gatehouse to reach the consular section and do their visa business. This is the private entrance for diplomats and for staff. Yeah, very, very secure. You can see how that works in section here with the public facade of the building and then the more private areas. Even inside the building, we were trying to dissolve that boundary between the public and the secure space. So although it's separated by glass, which is about 50 millimeters thick, you can still have a visual connection between these two areas. The materiality of the building was very much inspired by the site, the sort of rawness of the site, and also by the requirement for the security. We weren't going to shy away from the fact that this was essentially a bunker. So we expressed the concrete, boardmark concrete, and then the public facade is Corten steel. Here you see those two materials together, the boardmark concrete, and then corten steel, which is being used here for solar shading louvers. The steel was fabricated in Dubai, and it was shipped in. It was brought up that winding mountain road from the port. But most of the other materials we tried to use were locally sourced, and this is where our student travels came in handy, because we had a good contact with a local architect who was able to put us in touch with some of the best local craftsmen here. These guys are hand chiseling each block of stone to get the sort of characteristic textured finish. The stone it's called habash. It's a type of basalt, and it's laid in this very specific traditional way where the face of the stone is slightly slanted, so that on the top of each course is a very small ledge which catches the sun and gives the building this very delicate sort of stripy appearance. It's very beautiful. We also used a lot of mud. The mud is mixed with straw, and it's left on site in a big heap to ferment for a while before it's laid in these courses. And it's very it's almost like a dance, watching these builders laying the mud wall. They throw the balls of mud from one to the other, throw it up, slap it down, throw it up, slap it down. It's very rhythmical. This is how those mud walls looked at the end. The public facade of the building, where we had the most glass, had to be tested to see how it would perform in a bomb blast. So we mocked up one of these facade panels in a very remote part of Scotland, and we actually found it incredibly funny that the bomb that they used to detonate, to test it, looks exactly like the bomb that you see in your childhood cartoons. But the glass performed as it should, and as you can see, it flexed and the glass broke, but the interlayer within the laminated glass did its job, and it held it all together, so you didn't have dangerous shards of glass flying around. We tried to make the building very sustainable. Sanaa, being at high altitude, has very cold nights, but it has very hot days. And so the temperature under the ground was quite cold. So before we brought the air into the spaces and circulated it through the air conditioning system, we first of all passed it through about 200 meters of clay pipe under the ground to use the temperature of the ground to bring the air down to a more reasonable temperature. Inside the building, we were trying to combine elements of Britishness with elements of the host country. So we were using oak, English oak veneer panels, and then stained glass. This is the entrance from the upper level, the entrance that the diplomats would use. And following on in the tradition of Kasia's family, we took our children with us. We spent several weeks in Yemen while the project was nearing completion. This is Zosha, who's here today, aged 1.5, making new friends. So that was Yemen, and I stayed with design engine architects to deliver the embassy, but during that time we decided that we wanted to move to Poland to raise our growing family in connection with sort of Kasia's family and culture. So I tried to persuade Design Engine that we really needed a Polish office. So we did some competitions. We managed to win one in Gdansk for this Shakespearean theatre. It was a very interesting project, which I'd love to talk to you about, but I'm afraid we don't have time for that. But sadly, we didn't get to build it. And so after a while, I abandoned the idea of setting up a design engine office in Poland and moved on to becoming a more commercial sort of an architect. But before I talk about that, I'll pass back to Kasia to talk about Warsaw.
I think I'll try and hold the microphone closer this time.
So we lived in Poland for 6 years, during which time I was working for a design-led practice called DM's Architekci, and him, as he mentioned, became a commercial architect working for ADAS. And so my projects were mostly in Warsaw, in Poland, whereas Tim was spread all across the former Soviet Union and beyond, doing a lot of traveling and getting to know, a little bit more than just the European countries. But before I get into talking about any of the projects, just a bit of context, because architecture in Poland is very much linked to the geography, the history, and politics, and you can't really separate one from another. So this is Poland, with the Baltic to the north, and two major neighbors, Russia to the east and Germany to the west, taking up most of our border lines. And as you can see in this great map, we have a lot of wild animals. We have bison, one of the few places in Europe where wild bison still live in forests. We have elk. We have a lot of people with mustaches. That's quite common. And the favorite staple, which is pierogi, but I don't know where the big picture is. Anyway, you should try them. They're a bit like Chinese dumplings, really nice. So before the war, Warsaw was a really prosperous, multicultural European capital. This is a picture of the marketplace in the old town, which dates back to the Middle Ages. This is what the old town market square looked like straight after the war. There's nothing left of it. And this is what it looks like now. And the only reason why it survived the social realism that swept across the rest of the city was because of a massive grassroots movement by the local people who stood their ground and decided to rebuild it with their own hands. So this was rebuilt brick by brick from the rubble, based on architecture student drawings from before the war, which we had to do as well when I was during uni. So you kind of felt that you had to do the drawings well in case they had to be used again. And having lived in Poland and witnessed how important it was to recreate, something that was completely pulled down, made me question what we were taught and were drilled into during university times in the UK, where the idea of recreating architecture was always considered something slightly immoral and wrong, that we were not supposed to reinvent the past. But actually, with my Warsaw experience, I have a slightly more nuanced view of this. And I believe that restoration, if done well, allows you to link back to a valuable past that, in our case, would have been completely wiped out, by the 50 years of war and communist regime. And by recreating from scratch the old town square, we have the city of the heart of the city is back, which we would have lost otherwise. But most of Warsaw was a lot more mundane. There was a real shortage of housing, so all the housing that was being built was on big scale, and also in response to the very dense fabric that was there originally. With a socialist attitude, the houses were spread out very far, with a lot of light, a lot of space, views, which meant, on one hand, that there was a lot more space and light, but on the other hand, in terms of urban fabric, it was pretty grim, and there were no squares, no street corners, and big windswept spaces. And a little bit more of that, the scale of housing. Meanwhile, Stalin's Palace of Culture, which you can see here, was standing still and doing really well. So by the time the communist government collapsed in 1989, the Polish people were really ready for a change, and this is what most of us wanted for the Palace of Culture to happen. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So architects came up with a whole lot of ingenious ideas what to do with that space. So maybe build a pyramid and cover it up, or surround with a wall of towers. But none of that happened, and actually now Warsaw's moved on, and the resentments changed to an ironic humor, and now the Palace of Culture is a bit of an anti-icon of the city, and there's a proboscis monkey climbing it on a t-shirt. So going back into a bit more architecture, contemporary architecture. When we came back to Poland in the mid-2000s, that was a very exciting time to be back. Poland emerged from the communist regime, we joined the EU, and after a short period of fascination with Western fashions and indiscriminate copying of all the most trendy designs in the West, which were at the time mostly postmodern horrible buildings. Finally, Polish architects realized that there's an opportunity for a new identity and experimental look at the architecture. A lot of cutting-edge modern buildings started filling in the voids that were left in the cities. What you can see here is a new Jewish museum in Warsaw, designed by Finnish architects, and a canyon-like space in the middle that represents the journey of the Jewish people through the Red Sea. You can see it here. This is a new Philharmonic in Szczecin on the coast, recently completed, which glows at night and is a canvas for light installations at night. This is a museum and art events venue in Krakow in the south. Tim actually did a competition for that a few years back, but didn't win it. A new concert hall in Toruń. We're using quite experimental concrete formwork and crushed ceramics for the interiors. Quite beautiful. And this is a project that was done by Jens, who I worked for, in Katowice in the south. It's a convention center next to a futuristic icon from early 1970s. Being convention center, which is a kind of architecture that doesn't normally bring anything to the city, what we were trying to do is look at it differently. And the concept here is to create this folding three-dimensional landscape that leads people through our buildings and towards this big space which is used for concerts and events, and to create a interesting park, not just a plonker building in the middle of the city. And it's very successful, and it works through all the seasons. Some more projects from Jens. With a change of the attitudes and regime and more money, a lot of effort's gone into reinventing mass housing. And when you think about what we were used to over 40 years with the kind of dull tower blocks, this is pretty radical. This is not posh housing, this is normal housing. And a bit more of this. So it's an exciting time to be, and a lot of innovative thinking is coming through, and most of it is local companies. And people are very open to taking on new ways of living. And this is a project I worked on while at Jens. It's a new 5-star hotel at the airport in Warsaw, so if you ever come and visit, you'll probably see it. So I'll pass it over to Tim now.
I counted that during the 5 years that I worked for ADAS in Poland, I probably designed about 60 projects, 60. So about one every month or so. Each of these projects was the kind of project that, as a small architectural practice, you would absolutely kill together. It was thrilling to start with. We went into the projects with a lot of optimism, thinking that we were going to make a big mark on the city, but they always got to a point a bit like this, and then unfortunately didn't go much further. This was a design that we did for a mixed-use development in Armenia, with a tall residential and hotel tower and a convention centre at the base. We'd always present it with some flashy renderings and some sort of quite convincing looking diagrams. This was a mixed-use development built around a football pitch for the Krasnodar Dynamo football team. Some of the designs actually weren't too bad, and it was really quite frustrating to put a lot of love and energy into these visions and then see them come to nothing. This was the sort of redevelopment of one of the main railway stations in Moscow, where we were adding a lot of commercial real estate. This was a master plan for Minsk in Belarus, where we were adding 5.5 million square meters of new real estate. So these were huge, grand visions, and you know, really quite exciting projects. But after 5 years of producing lots of glossy renderings and reports, I decided that I'd had enough, and we sat down and asked ourselves where we wanted to go next. Kasia didn't want to go back to England. I didn't want to stay in Poland. And so we had to find a third place. And that's why we came to Singapore. So I sent my CV in to Kerry. I had an interview over Skype. I'd been interested in Kerry's architecture for a long time. Back from the days when Kerry Hill finished the Datai Hotel in Langkawi, because there was a connection there to the sort of use of vernacular concepts, which was something that interested me. Anyway, I was offered the job. We came to Singapore. This is an image from Amanyang, which is the project I've been working on for the last 6 years, and I'll talk about that in some detail in a minute. But first, I'll pass back to Kasia to talk about something she's been doing.
I joined ADAS as project architect for the transformation of the Myanmar Rail's headquarters building into a new luxury hotel for the Hong Kong and Shanghai hotels. You can see the building here. It's a beautiful heritage building from the colonial era, constructed for as headquarters for the rail company. After years of sanctions, Myanmar just opened up as I joined the practice, and it was a really exciting time to be out there and see how the country was bring in the Western influences. But also it was a really important time and an opportunity to make a really positive impact on the country and set a precedent in appropriate commercial reuse of colonial buildings, which they had and they still have plenty of, but they're all falling into disrepair and don't have much perceived value. These are some images from the late 19th century and middle of 20th century from the British era. Rangoon was designed as quite a grand city with British had high hopes for Burma at the time, with a very rigid city grid and grand buildings lining the leafy boulevards, and then some really quite striking traditional pagodas interspersed and also incorporated into the fabric of the city. What you see here is the site of the Myanmar Rail headquarters building, which I was working on. So it's just on the edge of the old city. It was designed from the day one as an office building. So we're talking about 1880s, and it grew over time. and was functioned in that as an office until mid-1990s, so for almost 100 years, and became quite an icon in the city, and it's very well known to everyone who's ever been to Yangon. The architecture was a mix of traditional influences and colonial architecture. It had brick and laterite stone walls. It's actually the only it's the only secular building that uses laterite in Burma, picking up from the local architecture, the quite ornate canopies overhanging over the windows, providing shade. So the building addressed the issue of the tropical climate with tall ceilings and these canopies and the thick walls. But that wasn't the fact that the case from the very beginning. And as we discovered doing studies of the history of the building, we discovered that it was built in phases, and the original phase was very much just a conventional British building with no canopies, no verandas. And then as the building expanded and was being used, these additions responded to the climate and made the building more suited to the tropical climate. So what you see here is the 3 wings, verandas facing the courtyard, and then a major thoroughfare through the middle of it. Considering its 110-year use, it was in a very good state. The materials used were mostly Burmese teak, which is super high quality and very, very durable. So even the staircases, which, if you think about the number of people using an office building over 100 years, would have normally been worn out, they were in pretty good shape. But unless there was a new use that gave money, there was no chance for the building to survive. It basically had to earn its keep. Together with the opening market in Yangon, new developments came in, and this was, on one hand, fortunately, on the other hand, unfortunately, the only way for the building to be preserved as part of a much bigger commercial mixed-use development, which was completely out of scale in the city. And driving this morning through Kuching, I can see a few of those buildings around here as well. I don't know how many of them are built to sustain the old, but this is definitely what's happening out there. In our concept, we concentrated mostly on refurbishing the old building and bring back the clarity of the original form, and the verandas, which were not fully constructed, and some of them were, there was quite a few alterations that were done over the years that we pulled down. And then the major intervention from us was just this very lightweight, quite modern, freestanding pavilion, which formed the main arrival lobby into the hotel. We're quite conscious of making sure that it was distinctly not trying to pretend that it was there before. It was in keeping with the architecture of the arcades that were quite dominant in the courtyard. So that was reinterpreted, and quite three-dimensional from the top, because you could see it from the hotel rooms facing the courtyard. So we were trying not to do a flat roof. One of the key features of the building was exceptionally tall ceilings. So that's hopefully going to make it into quite spectacular hotel rooms when it's completed. In order to get grasp of the form and scale of the hotel rooms, we had a plywood mock-up constructed in Hong Kong, and this was way before the ID consultants were appointed, with the layout that we did as architects. And you can see the scale. This is a client standing in the corner of the room with their 5-meter ceilings. It's just huge. But that was a really good way of getting the client to understand the space and to make decisions later on. A lot of effort got put into from our side into documenting the building and the state of the facade and all the components of the building, and then figuring out ways of restoring and reusing these elements. What you see here is a three-dimensional cross-section showing what was the main design principle that we applied. We tried to make this into a modern hotel. We would have had to either put in all the auxiliary spaces into the building, or expand it, or put them underground, and this is what we've done. So there was a basement story constructed across the entire site, including the towers that are adjoining our building, where we put all the back-of-house spaces, the spa, all the MEP rooms, and all the routing for the building was done actually through the high level of the basement, only coming up vertically where it needed to into the building. So the old building remained as intact as possible, without many changes. But that caused quite serious construction issues, because basically we had to suspend the building in the air while constructing a basement underneath the entire footprint, and also to deal with Yangon is on a seismic fault, so there's some serious earthquakes happening. So in order to conform with modern seismic code, we had to basically take all the internal walls out and build a new concrete frame. So what you see here is a solution that our structural engineers came up with for facade retention and underpinning that allowed the new frame and the new walls and roof to be constructed independently of the facade walls, which had to stay in place while everything else was being taken away. This is quite a recent photo from site that shows the heritage walls still in place with the retaining frame that you saw in the diagrams earlier, and the internal spaces being in the process of being dismantled and the roof being taken down, and the concrete basement, the basement beginning to be excavated around. And this is a little bit later, with just the wall standing. There's nothing left in the middle, and the basements are getting deeper. So the building will take another 2 or 3 years to complete, but this is quite an unusual solution. You won't see many of them, and can be done, so it's worth it.
Okay, this is the last project we're going to talk about. It's probably going to take another 20 or 25 minutes. I hope that's okay. I've been working on this project pretty much since I joined Kerry Hill Architects in 2012. The first phase of the project was finished earlier this year. We're still going with other phases. Kasia has now joined Kerry Hill Architects and is working with me on the next phase. The story of the project begins in Jiangxi province, about 700 kilometers southwest of Shanghai. About 20 years ago, the Chinese government was building a big hydroelectric dam, and hundreds of ancient houses and villages and thousands of trees were threatened with destruction. These beautiful Ming-Qing dynasty houses were abandoned, falling into disrepair. This is our client, Mr. Ma Dadong, standing with Kerry at the opening of Amanyangyun in April this year. You probably know Kerry, sadly, is no longer with us. This was Kerry's last site visit, as far as I know. Mr. Ma, when he was in his 20s, back in Jiangxi province, which is where he comes from, was distraught at all the destruction of this culture and these ancient forests. And he set about gathering together a team and trying to rescue some of the best houses. They meticulously catalogued each house, and they took it to bits, brick by brick. The houses are basically timber structures, but they're surrounded in this shell of brick, and they have these very elaborate stone gateways. The houses were brought to Shanghai, where Mr. Ma rented some warehouses and laid out the pieces, thoroughly documented them. Some of them are absolutely exquisite. Those warehouses are better than many museums that you'd find in London. The timbers were reassembled. Sometimes new pieces needed to be made to fill in the gaps. And during this process, Mr. Ma managed to find these extraordinary craftsmen and train them, and they managed to repair, replicate where necessary, quite complex details of these houses. But it wasn't just about the houses. There were forests of ancient camphor trees that were being lost in the construction of this dam. And so Mr. Ma set about moving those as well. Some of the trees are 2 meters in diameter, huge, and they had to remove motorway, toll booths, build roads, build bridges in order to get these trees from their location in Jiangxi province to a nursery in Shanghai where they were replanted. And then about 7 years ago, Mr. Ma approached Kerry Hill Architects and asked for ideas about what he could do with this amazing collection which he had. He had a site to the southwest of Shanghai. It's a fairly nondescript site, to be honest. It's very flat. It's surrounded by industrial areas on one side, new housing developments that are trying to look like something out of Versailles, the International Tennis Centre. There's a little river down here, and this area is where the trees have been temporarily replanted. So this was our master plan for 3 phases. There's a hotel, a lot of villas incorporating some of these antique houses. And then over here we have phase 2 with more villas, a bit of high-rise. And again, more villas down here in phase 3. And the final quadrant of this master plan is going to be a forest park where several thousand of these trees are going to be relocated. You might know this guy. This is Johnson Tan. He's a local from these parts. He was Mr. Ma's design manager, and he was actually a great supporter to Kerry Hill Architects while we were developing the design. And here you can see him helping us, trying to source materials, looking at a brick factory. This is the phase 1 master plan. This is now complete, and this is what I'm going to be showing you for the rest of the presentation. The phase 1 consists of Aman Yangyun, which is an Aman hotel. And then we have 44 villas here, which some of them are for private sale, some of them are part of the hotel, some of them incorporate the antique houses, some of them are completely contemporary. This is the view that we get as we arrive. You wouldn't know that the site was a completely flat, empty expanse when we started the project. We now have these camphor trees. This image is probably about a year old now. The tree canopies have grown a lot since, and you really have the sense that you're entering a forest that has already stood there for quite a few years. We designed the master plan to be a pedestrian space. Of course, by code, we had to provide access for vehicles, but the idea was that you should be able to walk around here without feeling like you're on a road. So the roads are narrow, they're windy, you don't get long axial views. Views are usually closed by trees. This tree is called the Emperor tree. This is the biggest tree that was moved from Jiangxi province, and it is absolutely vast. That's about 2 meters. This model shows the hotel part of the master plan. One of the challenges of designing a hotel like this in a site which is so nondescript is, how do you keep guests entertained? How do you make them want to stay here for several days? So we responded to that architecturally by creating a very dispersed plan, which creates a lot of different destinations, which can have very different landscape settings and offer very different experiences to the guest. This is our main arrival, which in a typical Chinese way, it's a walled courtyard. And then as we move into the hotel, there's a very deliberately orchestrated sequence of large and small spaces, courtyards, gardens, water features. From the arrival building, we can move through colonnades out to these pavilions in the garden, which look out over a lake. The lake was newly created as part of the project. We'll see more of these spaces as we go through the photos. But generally, the organisation is: we have the arrival here. This is the main spine of the hotel, which is a colonnade. Down here we have the all-day dining. We worked with a British landscape designer called Dan Pearson. So the landscapes are quite an interesting fusion of his background in English country gardens with his perceptions of Chinese classical garden design. This is the main central garden of the hotel. This is in one of those lakeside pavilions. This is the all-day dining pavilion. So you can see here the view across the lake. When I was talking earlier about creating settings, this was very important. Looking across from the restaurant to the forest park, and then again we have this cloud screen, which is the recurring motif throughout the project. This time the cloud screen is made in elm. This is the Chinese restaurant, much more internalized space. These are the private dining rooms. They look out onto this productive garden, which is a changing landscape, very seasonal, depending on which crops are being grown there. Inside the restaurant, we have views into internal courtyards. Entering the spa, again, a different sort of garden in the centre of the spa, which is the space that you circulate around as you walk to the treatment rooms. This is one of the treatment rooms. The relaxation space. A view out from the yoga room, again looking out across the lake. Okay, so that was the hotel part. Now I'll talk a bit about the villa element of it. Oh, what have we done? So the master plan for the villas was designed on a principle of cul-de-sacs and cluster courtyards. We have 4 villas which are entered down a very narrow road, and then you reach a cluster courtyard, and from that cluster courtyard you can enter into each one of these different 4 villas. 2 of these villas here are what we call antique villas, because they have at their heart one of the antique houses that's been bought from Jiangxi province. The other 2 villas are completely contemporary, where instead of the antique house we have a contemporary living dining pavilion in the centre of that garden. But one of the main building blocks of the master plan is the guest suite, and you can see here we have a standard guest suite module which occurs in both villa types. Depending on the size of the antique house, we might have either 2, 3, sometimes even 4 external guest suites, and then the rest of the bedrooms are actually located inside the house itself. So this is a view from the cluster courtyard, approaching the entrance to the villa. I was talking earlier about how the architecture of the hotel is an orchestrated sequence of spaces. The same is true in the villas, and this is something that we picked up from our understanding of Chinese architecture. It's all about how spaces of different scales unfold as you move through the building. So here we've entered the arrival courtyard with a trellis overhead, with a wisteria growing on it, through a moon gate into a water court, which is a very compressed space, before the view opens up into the garden. And this is one of the contemporary pavilions sitting in the middle of the garden here. Again, we use the cloud screen along some of these walkways to create a screen. In this case here, it's actually in bronze, solid bronze. We did various options looking at possible cheaper alternatives, which would have been in stainless steel with a patina applied, but in the end the client decided, no, we're going to pay the extra money, we're going to go for real bronze because we understand that this is a material which is going to get better with time as it starts to weather. This is the detail of one of those bronze screens which casts the most beautiful shadows at certain times of day. So this is the guest suite. As I said, this is one of the key building blocks of the master plan. We have a lot of these across the project. The guest suite is organised almost like a contemporary version of one of those antique houses where it's very inward looking. It's organised around 2 private courtyards. The first space that we enter is a study, and then we pass through a robe area into the bedroom. The bedroom takes light from both sides from these courtyards through screens. And then at the very back here we have the ensuite. This is that entrance space, the study. This is the bedroom. You can see the filtered light coming into the room through the cloud screen. This cloud screen is also made in elm. All of the furniture that you see, all of the artifacts that you see, all of the lighting, was all designed by us. Every single detail of the project. We have a team of interior designers at Kerry Hill Architects as well. So it was a very integrated, multidisciplinary approach. Here you see one of the central courtyards and the ensuite bathroom. The big surprise that you don't know until you really get to know the project is that these villas have huge basements underneath. And these basements were designed to have big gallery spaces where owners could keep their very valuable art collections. There's a very secure safe room also in the basement. You can see the layout of a typical basement here, with the gallery space, the safe room. We have a tea room, a pretty large wine cellar, a private cinema, a gym, and then a sunken garden to bring light down to this. This is a look at one of the antique villas. This view also gives you an idea of the scale of the master plan. It really is vast. We have each of these antique houses sitting in the middle of its own garden. Here with one of the guest suites. The screened walkways. The antique houses too, they have similar basements underneath them. Here you can see quite clearly the arrangement of the house and how that contemporary guest room was picking up on this same type of internalized space. So because they're so internalized, the antique houses have quite a plain external appearance, which was fine for the lifestyle that the original owners lived, but for a contemporary building, a contemporary dwelling, it's not very well suited. We needed to find a way to get more light into the house, but the challenge was, how do we do this without totally changing that monolithic clarity that the external appearance of the buildings had? So the way that we approached that was, we said, well, if we really have to create a window, we're going to make it a very strong, very contemporary feature, so that there's absolutely no doubt this is a contemporary intervention. So our new windows are about 2 by 2 meters, punched into the fabric of the house. But that wasn't enough. Sometimes we needed to also bring a bit more light and ventilation into the internal courtyards of the houses. And we devised a way to use the traditional bricks that the house is built from to create these perforated screens to get a bit more light and ventilation into the house. And they actually create quite a beautiful play of light on the interior at certain times of day. The other big challenge that we had with these houses was, when we repurpose them, we have to bring them up to compliance with modern building codes. Of course, these houses weren't designed with insulation in mind. So we worked very hard to find a way that we could keep the timber panelling of the houses as thin as possible, using very high performance insulation, only 15 millimeters thick, creating an insulated sandwich, which allowed us to maintain the traditional expression of the structure. You can imagine that if this became a 200 millimeter thick wall, we would have completely lost all of these columns and beams, which are so essential to reading the beauty of these houses. Also, the client was very clear with us from the beginning that he wasn't creating a museum. The first task for Kerry Hill Architects was to make sure that these houses were fantastic spaces to live in. So we had many, many meetings with his team of conservation experts and craftsmen, trying to work out how could we adapt the structure of these houses where we needed to maybe move a wall by a meter, for example, in order to get enough space to put a double bed in. We came up with a set of principles that said that there were certain trusses and elements we could move in certain directions without undermining firstly the structural integrity, and secondly the spatial meanings in the house. So a lot of the structure that you see here, it still feels comfortable, but it might not be in exactly the same position that it was originally. If we did add a new partition, like we've done here, to enclose a space which was actually traditionally in the original house, this would have been a covered space, but it would have been totally open. If we added a new partition, again, we did it in a very contemporary way, so that there was no mistaking what was new and what was old. This is the living room space. We also stripped out a lot of ceilings. Some of these houses would have been lived in by several families recently over the last years, and it was quite difficult when Mr. Ma's team first went in to actually read the original spaces. All of the new stuff was all stripped out, back to the bare bones. This is one of the ensuite bathrooms. Working with our interior designers, we took a lot of pains to make sure that what we did in the interior design didn't obscure the original structure and feel of the house. So all of the furniture, even looking at things like vanity counters in the bathrooms, all of that was done as a freestanding element set away from the fabric of the house, so that we didn't mess with the understanding of the original. This is one of the most beautiful structures of all. This is a building called the Nan Shifang within our master plan, which was, I think, a clan house originally. And this has been kept as a public building. This is a cultural centre. This is not for private use. One of the extraordinary things about building a hotel nowadays is that you instantly get feedback on your work. As soon as the doors open and you get visitors coming in, you start to see a whole flood of Instagram and Facebook and TripAdvisor posts. Usually it's about the food, it's not very often about the architecture. But we do get some really interesting interpretations of the spaces. And it's actually wonderful to see how people are inhabiting and using the spaces and reacting to the things that we've designed. Now this is the last thing. This is just a short video of the opening of Amanyangyun in April this year. It was a fantastic event. We had opera singer from Paris, drummers from Taiwan, classical Chinese opera. The whole thing was very beautifully put together. So that was it. The hotel's now open. Like I say, we're working on the next phases of the project. And that's the end of our talk. It's been a bit of a mixed bag. I hope there's been the right balance of architectural projects and sort of adventure in the talk. I'm very happy to take any questions.